Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Wednesday, March 35th, and sorry for the delay in getting this up to you guys. We had a department meeting this morning, so I'm a little bit behind schedule in terms of putting out videos. What's that? Did I say 35th? My wife says the wrong date. It's not March 35th? Man, time goes by fast. March 25th. Trolls everywhere. Anyways, yeah. So yeah, sorry for the video getting up a little bit late. I'm sure most of you guys are probably still sleeping anyway, so you don't really care. Hey, just a few things before we get started today. If you haven't checked your email yet, we just got an announcement from the San Mateo County Office of Education, either the district office or the site. The site. Mrs. Zinsky probably emailed that already, but if you haven't already seen it, we are officially going to be out of school until May 1st. So the attendance stuff is pushed back to May 1st. So we are not officially not coming back after spring break. That probably comes as no surprise to you guys. Definitely the right thing to do. In fact, I would have been really concerned if we were coming back after spring break because it's going to take a lot more time to sort out all this COVID stuff. So that doesn't mean that we're necessarily coming back May 1st. I think they're just extending it, and then they're going to reassess and then see how things go from there. So that's kind of a little update about how school is going. It was really great seeing you guys on our Zoom talk yesterday. It was nice to hear from everybody, see your faces, and just see that you guys are doing okay. We did have some folks that did not make it onto that, and so if you didn't see them on there, reach out to them, check in with them, see how they're doing. That personal connection is really, really important right now as we're all pretty isolated. Okay, let's go ahead and jump right into today's topic so that this doesn't take too long. We are going to continue in our discussion of the nervous system in chapter 48. I really, really love this part of the chapter. We get into some really interesting things, so a lot to share with you. I also found a really cool 3D brain, I don't know if simulation is the right word, brain model that I'll kind of click through, and I'll share a link with that with you guys below so that you can check it out for yourself and kind of play with it. So last time we talked, I was going over how a neuron works and basically how an individual neuron uses a combination of action potentials and neurotransmitters to pass on a certain message. And today we're going to zoom out and look at the nervous system in the big picture, just to see a little more about how it's actually organized, how it functions, and how it's divided both in terms of its structure but also its function. Kind of review with you a little bit. The vertebrate nervous system is organized into into two parts that are centered around how we evolve, and that is that has to do with the fact that we are highly cephalized. Right? You remember that in our diversity unit, as we evolved as animals, more and more of those neurons and ganglia started to accumulate in this region called the head, and that's going to eventually form the brain and then the spinal cord that branches off from that. So there's a very distinct central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, which you can see in this picture. And then from that, you have the extension of all these nerves, both from the spine and from the brain itself. The nerves coming off the brain, we talked about last time, those are called cranial nerves. And then you have the spinal nerves that come down the spine and then branch off to all the different parts of your body. So that's a quick thing about how it's organized. Now, in addition to that, there's some other things to know. Within the nervous system, we have our own little circulatory system. What I mean by that is, there's still blood that's being delivered through all the arteries to your brain. But the brain itself and the spinal cord have their own little chamber that's filled with a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. That's also known as CSF. And this fluid helps to kind of regulate a lot of the ionic concentrations that are needed, helps to carry a lot of the waste away from the brain. And I think to a certain degree, it can also help keep the brain cool. Right? Remember, the brain's using a lot of energy to reset those neurons to be able to fire more action potentials. And so we're using a lot of energy, which means we're doing a lot of cell respiration, which means we're generating a lot of heat. And And so the inside of the brain actually is made up of these hollow chambers called ventricles. And if you ever look at a cross section of the brain, you'll see these little holes. Depending on if you're toward the front of the brain or to the back of the brain, these chambers can be bigger or smaller. But these ventricles are filled with this cerebral spinal fluid, as is the spinal cord. In the middle of the spinal cord, there's like a hollow tube that's filled with the fluid, and the fluid is able to kind of move around pretty freely, and that helps to transport nutrients and waste and hormones throughout the brain. Now, outside of the brain, in your skull, your brain is actually wrapped in a couple of membranes, and one of them is called the dura mater, and there's also another one called the pia mater. In that bag, you have also a ton of cerebral spinal fluid, and so the brain's kind of like floating inside of your skull, which is a really nice thing. If you didn't have that, every time you moved your head, your brain would be slamming against your skull, and we call that a concussion. Some of you guys might have had that before, right? So to help cushion the brain, we also fill the skull with cerebral spinal fluid. And that's the reason why when I was doing my EMT work, if you ever get into ER work, when someone's in a traumatic accident, like a car accident, one of the things we actually check is we look in their ear and we try to look for any clear liquid that might be leaking out. And yeah, we're looking for that CSF. If there's liquid coming out, that means that there's some significant brain damage or skull damage, and now that fluid's leaking out. And that's an indicator that it takes a lot of force to damage that stuff. But that's something that we look for. Okay. Now, in addition to this, another thing that you want to kind of be familiar with is this gray matter versus white matter. When you look at an actual brain, this is obviously a picture, but when you do a cross-section of the brain and the spinal cord, you'll notice some parts of the brain are darker in color, that's called the gray matter, and some parts are lighter in color, that's called the light or white matter. And the reason why you see the difference in that is because the white matter, it gets its color because those are where most of the axons are found. And remember, axons are myelinated, so they have that fat that's wrapped around that axon. And in the big picture, that fat ends up giving the brain and the spinal cord a lighter appearance. Whereas the gray matter are the unmyelinated portions of the neurons. Those are mainly going to be the dendrites. And so you can see all around the outside of the cerebral cortex, you got the darker gray matter out there. Okay. And again, the white matter is the myelinated axons. Okay, so let's look at how the nervous system is actually organized. The first thing is it's divided into you have your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system, right? Now, within the peripheral nervous system, so these are all the nerves that leave the spinal cord and leave your brain and go out to the body. Those nerves are kind of broken up into two networks that have two very different jobs. The first is the somatic nervous system, and this is the part of the nervous system that is all voluntary. Okay, now if you think about it from your whole body, the only thing you have like conscious control over in terms of like turning things on or off are your muscles, right? All your organs, like your heart, your lungs are a little bit of a gray area, but your digestive system, your kidneys, all of those run automatically. You can't like tell your kidney to stop filtering your blood. You can't tell your digestive system to increase digestion. Those things happen on their own. So the voluntary aspect, really, if you think about it, is just controlling the skeletal muscles. Okay, and that's controlled by the somatic nervous system. That links up to the part of the brain that does a lot of your motor control. The other part of that is your autonomic nervous system, and this is your involuntary nervous system. This is the part that you don't have to think about. It just automatically runs on its own. And obviously that's also going to be the most important part, right? Even if your somatic nervous system's damaged, you are going to be paralyzed, you can't move, but what keeps you alive is that autonomic nervous system that controls all your organs and tells your heart to beat and your breathing to take place and your digestion to happen and excretion, all that stuff. Now, the autonomic nervous system is broken up into two divisions. Okay, sorry, the PowerPoint's a little out of order. And those two divisions are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. You see, all your organs that keep you alive all of them collectively can be in two modes at any given time. And what are those two modes? Well, in an animal's lifetime, whether it's a human or a deer or a wolf, the two modes you're going to be in are in your kind of like chillin' mode, right? This is what we call the rest and digest mode, when you're feeling safe, you're feeling comfortable, you're thriving, you're growing, and you're just doing the self-maintenance stuff, like everything's fine. and that's your parasympathetic nervous system. The other mode that you're going to switch into, and we get this from our ancestors, right? From the earliest animals, they already had this built in, is the other side is your survival mode. That's also called your fight or flight response, and that's also referred to as your sympathetic nervous system. And so both of these systems are kind of like they both oversee the same organs. You'll see a really great diagram in the next slide. All the organs are controlled by both of these, but depending on what scenario you're in, one system is going to be more dominant than the other. So if you're not stressed out and you're chilling and you're just eating and you're sleeping in, just think like vacation mode, right? Everything's pretty low stress, then most of your body is going to be run by the parasympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system. And your body's really, your brain is just sending out information, telling the body, hey, just grow, hey, just repair yourself. We've eaten a lot of food, we're sleeping a lot, let's just, take care of things. But let's say you're in July and you're in the middle of the vacation, and then you're crossing the road and a car doesn't see you and slams on its brakes and thankfully doesn't hit you. In that moment, your life is in danger. And so you're going to switch from the parasympathetic nervous system to the sympathetic. Adrenaline's going to be released. Your brain's going to be sending out signals to the heart, telling your heart rate to go up, your breathing to go up. You're getting ready to do whatever it takes to survive. And so in our entire lifetime, it's really the kind of the balance of these two systems that are always at play. Okay, and again, they're going to regulate the same list of organs, but they're going to tell those organs to do two very different things depending on the situation. And we'll take a closer look at that. The last division of your system, and this actually, it can be a little confusing because of the way that the PowerPoint is organized. This actually falls under your autonomic, is the enteric system, the enteric division. The process of digesting, absorbing nutrients, and getting rid of waste is so complicated that your brain has a separate network set up just dedicated to controlling those digestive organs. That's not to say that the organs are not managed by the sympathetic and parasympathetic, but they kind of have their own little management system over there. So these three divisions, the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric division, they fall under the autonomic nervous system. And thankfully, unless you have some kind of major brain issue or you get into a significant trauma, the autonomic nervous system is going to do its job, and that's going to keep you alive. Okay, so you can think of all this as the automatic stuff, and then this is the voluntary stuff, which is the movement of your muscles. Now, here's the diagram I was telling you about. I'm not going to go through all of this. There's a lot going on here. But what you can see here is that the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems can control the same body part, but have two very, very different responses. Okay, and so I'm going to just pick a couple to highlight to you so you can get a better idea of what's happening. And then we'll also talk about how this relates to how we manage stress nowadays as humans that are working and going to school. So let's start with something really simple, the eyes. Your nervous system is connected to your eyes. It's one of the cranial nerves. I can't remember. I think it's the optic nerve, must be. And when you're in your parasympathetic mode and you're chilling and everything's really relaxed, your eyes are going to dilate the pupils, which means the holes in your eyes get smaller. That decreases the amount of light that comes in. And you don't really need that because when you're safe and you're sleepy and you're eating, you're not like having to watch what's going on around you to stay alive. So the pupils will constrict, and that limits the amount of information that comes in. But once there's danger, right, and you guys might have seen this in movies before, like when the spider sense goes off in Spider-Man, his pupils will dilate. And that actually happens in real life. When you are in danger, your brain goes, whoa, something's going on. We have to be able to take in all the information in front of us, and we become hypersensitive in our senses. And the way we do that with our eyes is to open up your pupils more, so that more light and more your vision basically increases in that moment. So you can see one organ, which is the eye, but two very different responses depending on if your parasympathetic or sympathetic division is kicking on. Let's move into your chest. Look at the heart and the lungs, right? When you're sleeping or you're eating, the heart rate is going to decrease, your blood pressure is going to decrease because it's chilling, right? You're just focusing on delivering nutrients and oxygen, but none of the cells are in really high need at that time. So if the parasympathetic division is kicking in, your heart rate's going to slow down. Your lungs, the bronchi, are going to constrict. They're going to close up a little bit because you're not going to be using as much oxygen because you're not using energy, right? You're not doing cell respiration. Now, in the moment that you go into fight or flight, the sympathetic takes over, right? And now you're getting ready to run away from that bear or to fight back, or whatever it is. So the heart rate's automatically going to accelerate. Your breathing is going to increase. The bronchi are going to open up. They're going to dilate so that you can bring in more oxygen. All those adjustments happen in milliseconds, or in seconds, actually it's milliseconds, so that your body can start oxygenating your blood and delivering sugar to all your cells, specifically your muscles, so that you can be running and fighting and doing whatever it takes to survive. So again, you can see same organ, two very different responses. Moving down into the digestive system, I know I mentioned the enterics division does oversee this, but both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems can also regulate this too. And here's the deal. If you're feeling safe and you're in their parasympathetic, there's going to be a lot of blood flow going to your digestive system, right? Because you're eating and you want to bring the blood to pick up those nutrients. Everything is good and you're feeling safe. But in the moment of danger, breaking down nutrients and absorbing those nutrients kind of become a secondary priority. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're eating if you're about to die. So the sympathetic division in the moments of fight or flight will actually send neural signals to your digestive tract to shut down and shunt blood and push the blood away from your digestive system to the muscles, to where the oxygen and nutrients are actually needed. And that's the reason why when we get nervous, people sometimes say that they get like a butterfly in their stomach feel, when they're about to ride a roller coaster, or they're about to take a big test, or they're about to ask that person to the dance. That's their sympathetic division kicking in, telling the stomach like, we're in fight or flight mode, let's shut down the digestive tract. And so sometimes you can actually feel those changes happening. Okay. Now, another thing related to digestion is your liver. I don't know if you guys remember this, but when you have extra sugar in your body, your liver stores it as a polysaccharide called glycogen, right? And so when you are in the rest and digest mode, in the parasympathetic mode, the liver is collecting sugar, it's storing it as glycogen for a backup. When you switch over to fight or flight mode, you now need that sugar to power your muscles to do the fighting and flighting. And so the liver will then respond to the sympathetic division by releasing glucose, right? And what helps with that is actually the hormone adrenaline, which we'll talk about when we get to the endocrine system later. Okay, so those are the major things that are taking place with the parasympathetic and sympathetic, and you can kind of see this theme over and over and over again. They're kind of antagonistic divisions of your nervous system that will regulate this list of all the organs. Now, the fun one that is a little bit funky and but is really interesting to look at is actually sexual reproduction. Down here at the very bottom, you can see that the parasympathetic division promotes erection of genitalia, and that's not just with penises. There is a certain degree of erection that can happen in the clitoris in women and females, and so the parasympathetic system kicks in during the early stages of arousal, right? But on the other side, you can see that the sympathetic division promotes ejaculation and vaginal contractions. In other words, it's related to orgasms. Now, you may be looking at this and be like, wait, why are you having orgasms when you're running from a bear? You are not, okay? That's the last concern you're going to have when you're running from a bear. But during sex and during the process of sex, in the early stages of arousal, and then as we move closer to orgasm and to ejaculation and all of that, both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems actually play a role in that. And so that's kind of just an interesting and fun fact, that reproduction is actually controlled by both of them. Yeah, that's a fun fact. Now, how can you remember this? Probably the easiest way to remember it is just for the parasympathetic, just know that as the rest and digest mode, right? Your body is very calm, you're resting, you're digesting. The sympathetic, again, is that fight or flight. So pretty easy way to remember that. Now, before I move on to the next thing, really quick, I just want to talk about how this applies to you guys as students and how we manage stress. Yesterday on the live stream, Hosea asked about like why some people are more vulnerable to stress, right? And we did talk about like the neuroscience behind that. But another thing that you got to realize, and this is super like insightful, that I got this actually at a conference at Stanford. It was about understanding student stress, and a lot of parents and students and teachers were there. But this doctor was trying to talk about how, as animals, right, if we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, animals, even 5,000 years ago never had to deal with stress the same way that we did, right? And what I mean by that is they didn't have like SATs or college apps or anything like that. If you go and look at the rest of animal history and evolution, the only time you were stressed out is really when your life is in danger, right? And what that means is that the brain has evolved in a way that copes with stress in one way and one way only, and that is to activate the sympathetic division. Because if you're a deer, that's all you need, right? So when we fast forward to humans, it's kind of interesting because we obviously have different stressors in our lives that are not actually threatening our lives, right? Like if you're taking a test and you're freaking out, or you're getting college apps and you're stressed out, it's not actually a matter of life or death. Even if you might feel like it in that moment, it's not actually threatening your life. However, despite that, your body and your brain is only wired to respond to stress in one way, which is to act like your life's in danger. Okay, and that's an important thing to understand as students when you're in a stressful situation, whether it's related to school or social stuff or family stuff or other circumstances, that when we are in stress, the sympathetic division kicks in and your body on a neural level acts exactly the same way as if you were about to die and you're being chased by a bear or your life is being threatened. And that can actually contribute to the stress even more. And that's why people end up having a lot of anxiety and panic attacks about this because it's actually tied to your sense of mortality. So how do we fight back against this and kind of compensate? Well, the answer is actually really, really simple, because in all of this, remember, all of this is autonomic, right? All of this is involuntary. So your brain does this automatically, but there is one part of your body in all of this that you actually have manual control over. Can you think about what that is right now? If you're thinking the lungs, you are correct. And the lungs are the one thing, the one part of your body that actually overlaps between both the autonomic and your if I go back to this picture here, your lungs sit in between your autonomic and your somatic nervous systems. Okay, and what I mean by that is you can do this right now, and you might start freaking out a little bit, but this whole time you've been breathing and you haven't thought about it, right? But the moment you think about it and you inhale and exhale, now you just switched your breathing from the autonomic side of your brain to the somatic side of your brain. Now you're breathing voluntarily, okay? And that can create a little panic for some people because you're like, oh my God, if I stop thinking about breathing, am I gonna stop breathing? The answer is no. The moment you stop thinking about it, the autonomic's gonna take over again, right? But when we're looking at a stress response, this thing also applies, which means that when you're stressed out, your breathing rate increases, and that further tells your body that you're in a stressful situation. And so what can you do to manage your stress? You slow down your breathing. Okay, this is why it's built into any kind of mindfulness or meditation practices to control your breathing and to take literally just to take a deep breath. That's the saying. When you take a deep breath and you slow down your breathing, you're overriding your sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system's freaking out, your heart rate's going up. When you slow down your breathing, you're actually telling that part of your brain, hey, we're not actually in danger. We don't need to go into fight or flight response. Let's stay calm. And that will actually soothe and suppress a lot of those messages going out to your organs. Your heart rate will slow down. Your digestion will kick in again. Your pupils will start to constrict again. And we go back and we switch back to a parasympathetic sympathetic state or mode simply by regulating that breathing. Okay, so that's a big pro tip for you guys. If you ever get in a stressful state, just close your eyes, take 8 good deep breaths. Everyone does a little differently, but I think you breathe in on 4 counts and exhale on 7 counts. If you're just manually taking over your breathing, you can manage your stress response that much better. Same thing when you're sleeping. If you're having trouble falling asleep because there's a million things going on through your head, I deal with that pretty much every night. What I will do is just close my eyes and I just focus on my breath and breathe, and you'll be amazed at how well you can override a lot of that automatic stuff. Okay, so I know that was a bit of a big tangent, but it's also just a life-changing. That's some life-changing knowledge there for you. So since we're at this point where you're watching this for enrichment, I hope that you got something out of that, and hope that was helpful. Okay, the last part of this lecture, I just want to go through the different parts of the brain and then show you the modeling. And there's a lot of detail in here. And again, you can take as much or as little as you want out of this. But for those of you guys that are interested in how the brain works, you're gonna really like this. When the brain is developing, it actually develops in stages, okay? And the first thing that differentiates when that mass of cells is developing in the brain is it divides into three parts: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, okay? And like literally it just means the front brain, the middle of the brain, and the back of the brain. As it continues to develop, like at 5 weeks, okay, and this is a little confusing because this says the embryo at 1 month, and then this says it at 5 weeks. So I'm not exactly sure because 5 weeks is 1 month. But anyways, in later stages of development, maybe it's 5 weeks later, I don't know. Each of those three regions will develop into more specific regions that you don't need to worry about. I was a neuro major, we memorized and studied all this, but you have the telencephalon, mesencephalon, and myelencephalon. You don't need to worry about that. What you want to understand is what's happening is all those cells, which remember are genetically identical, they're going through levels of gene regulation to differentiate those neurons and cells to make certain networks that eventually make up all the brain structures, like your cerebrum and your midbrain, your medulla, parts that we're going to talk about right now. So you don't need to memorize any of this, but you should know that as the brain's developing, it's splitting itself up into more and more specific jobs, and that's how the brain is able to be so specialized. That's something that we see all the way up to the earliest stages of development, even at 1 month of development. So let's go through some of those parts. Let's start with the most basic parts, okay? Before we get to like all the reading and writing and facial recognition and all that, let's just focus on like the basics of what an animal needs to survive. And the very first thing is your brainstem. The brainstem has the important function of maintaining homeostasis in all your vital functions. So all those autonomic functions that we just talked about with the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, that's all regulated by this part of your brain, in the brainstem. This part of the brain is going to transmit information from the spine to the brain. So it's going to communicate with those organs and make sure that all the organs are working correctly. A couple parts to mention here. You have the midbrain that integrates the sensory information. That's this part right here. So as the information from your eyes, your ears, your skin, your mouth are coming in, the midbrain is going to take a lot of that, and working with another part called the thalamus is going to process that sensory information and then forward it to the part of the brain that's responsible for that. This part is also responsible for your circadian rhythms of sleep and arousal. They're going to work with your amygdala. That actually helps with that also. Wait, it's not amygdala. It's your pineal gland. Sorry, I got it mixed up there. Below that, you have the pons and the medulla oblongata. There's that word again, medulla, which means the inner part, and that is this part right here. That's in the very, very center of your brain. And this is going to control a lot of your visceral functions. Those are the autonomic functions like your breathing, your heart rate, and blood vessels, as well as digestion. So basically, everything you need to stay alive is right here in the brainstem. Okay, and you may have watched TV or seen movies where like they talk about people being brain dead. What that usually means is that the upper part of their brain is not functioning. Okay, if they're brain dead but they're still alive, that means they're not having like cognitive thoughts. Their brain's not able to like process sensory information necessarily, but the brainstem is still working because that's why they're still alive. Their heart rate's still going. They're still breathing. That's because all this is functioning. Okay. Now, some other brain parts. In the back, you have the cerebellum. This part manages your motor coordination, and it's a more specific type of motor coordination. What the cerebellum does is it integrates the sensory information with your motor movement. So, for example, if you're like a gymnast and you're walking along that balance beam, right? You have sensory information coming in all the time from your eyes about your, seeing the balance beam. You have information coming in from your vestibular system telling you about your balance, if you're leaning left or you're leaning right. And what the cerebellum does is it takes that information and it couples it with the control panel for your actual muscles, so that if you start feeling your balance go off on one side, the muscles can compensate on the other side by balancing it out. And so cerebellum helps to coordinate those two things. When people have cerebellar injuries, you can tell because even something as simple as like picking up a cup, their hands gonna be really shaky, and they're gonna have a hard time coordinating what they see with how their muscles move, and that's because that's the job of the cerebellum. Another part in the middle is called the thalamus, and as I mentioned earlier, this is the input sensor for the sensory information. You can kind of think of this as like the main operator that receives the call and then forwards that call to the different parts of the brain. This is the input center for sensory information, but it's also an output center for motor information. So this upper part of the region is where of your brain, that's where a lot of your motor control, right, your voluntary stuff with the somatic nervous system, that's where it all originates, in the upper part of this brain. And to send that out to your muscles, all that information passes through the thalamus. So the thalamus is really like that operator. It regulates all the information coming into your brain, and it regulates all the motor muscular information going out of your brain. Okay? And then finally, you have your hypothalamus, which is the word literally just means hypo, which means below the thalamus. And the hypothalamus is right in this region here. You'll see it in the model in a sec. And that part does regulate your circadian rhythms, but also really important, we've talked about this, H stands for homeostasis. Okay, so all the information about your water balance, your oxygen CO2 levels, your blood sugar, all that stuff comes into the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, checks it, makes sure that we're in balance, and if it needs to make adjustments, it'll do that. And one of the ways it does that is by talking to this little P-shaped structure right here. It's just hanging down. That's your pituitary gland, and that's the master gland for your endocrine system. Almost anything in your body that is off can be adjusted by telling that pituitary gland to release a hormone into the blood, and then the hormones carried to that organ. So we've seen that already with the kidneys. Remember with ADH, that's where it comes from. If your salt and water balance are off, the hypothalamus will tell the pituitary gland to release ADH, and then you can adjust the water and salt concentrations of your urine. Okay, last thing, the cerebrum. The cerebrum is kind of what most people think of when they see the brain. This is the upper part of your brain. Let me move myself down here. What this does is basically a lot of things, depending on what part of the brain it is. You have sensory information that's analyzed. You have motor commands that are issued from here. Language is generated. Your ability to read and write is there. Decision making is made in the frontal lobe. There's a lot of like really high order functions that happen here. And so the cerebrum is kind of what like humans kind of brag about in terms of like our ability to be the smartest animal on earth. We do correlate the size of the cerebrum with intelligence. And there are other animals. We're not the only ones. Elephants, dolphins are very, very intelligent animals, and that has to do with how much their cerebrum is developed. Now, if you look at other animals that are not as cognitively capable, like a lizard, for example, you're going to see that their cerebrum is pretty small. It doesn't have all those folds. Remember, folds add surface area, which means we can pack a lot more stuff in there. Earlier animals don't have that much folding, so they're not going to have as much of ability, to do a lot of these things that are listed here. But what is fully developed, even for a lizard, and really ours is not that different than a lizard, is the part in the midbrain and the lower brain, in the brainstem. All those autonomic functions, we are basically we're not that much further developed and evolved compared to a lizard in those particular regions of the brain, because not much has changed throughout the years. Survival is survival, right? Now, the cerebrum is split up into two hemispheres. You have the right hemisphere and left hemisphere. There's a little bit of arguing and controversy as to if this is really true, but traditionally we say that the left does a lot of your language, your math, your logic, kind of the smart stuff. And then if you're a right brain person, that it does a lot of the creative, emotional processing, pattern recognition, visual stuff. There's the jury is still a little bit out as to like whether or not that's really locked in. And the reason we think that, or why we question that, is because there are some people that, for one reason or another, have to go through brain surgery, and they have entire sections of their brain removed, maybe because of cancer, maybe because they have seizures. And what we find is that over time, those people still are able to do a lot of those things. And that means that the brain, even if it's like divided left and right, it's pretty, actually the word for it is plasticity, which means that it's really flexible. So if one of the parts of the brain is removed or damaged, other parts of the brain can rewire themselves to take on that task. And that's called neuroplasticity. It's a really, really awesome phenomenon that we see, that people, even after a traumatic surgery or accident, can regain the ability to read or write or recognize faces, even if in the years after their accident they lose that ability, they can get that back because the brain can rewire itself. Now, how does the left and right brain talk to itself, or talk to each other? We have this thick band of axons that bridge the right and left sides, and that's called the corpus callosum. Okay, and that's actually really visible in this in a side what's called a sagittal view of a brain. This band right here, this big kind of clear blob, that's the corpus callosum, and that allows the right and left side of the brain to communicate. Also, something kind of fun to know is that from a motor perspective, in terms of moving your muscles, the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. And that's why when people have strokes, my grandmother had a stroke when I was in first grade. She had a stroke, I think, on the right side of her brain, and so she had a lot of paralysis on the left side of her body. Luckily, she was able to get some physical therapy and help with that. So that's kind of how the cerebrum is organized. If we go, you can divide it into lobes. I'm not going to go into this into too much detail because it's pretty easy to read up on. But the frontal lobe is, I don't know if all this is, it doesn't go through all in the PowerPoint. But the frontal lobe is a lot of our decision making. This is the part that you always hear teachers and parents talking about frontal lobe development. This doesn't really fully develop until you're 25, and that's why teenagers often make really stupid choices and you don't really have a lot of reasoning. A lot of you guys do, but even if you feel like you're pretty good, you still have quite a few years ahead of you of development, which means your brain's going to get that much better at making good decisions. And that all takes place up here. Here's the motor cortex towards the back. That's where a lot of your voluntary movement originates from. Somatosensory is where your senses are processed. Speech, taste, reading, that's all in this yellow region called the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe does a lot of the visual stuff, so visual association, your sense of vision, processing, that's all processed back there. If you get hit in the back of the head hard enough, people can go blind, not because their eyes are damaged, but because the part of the brain that processes that information is damaged. And then on the sides here, this is called the temporal lobe, like right around your ears. That's where your sense of smell, your hearing, and auditory associations are processed. So there's a lot of specialization. And again, these are just the 4 regions of the cerebral cortex only, just on the outside. Okay, and this picture here is just kind of funny. This actually shows specifically the motor and sensory cortex, how the different parts, the different folds of the membrane. So this is the left side of the cerebrum, how each part is actually responsible for a different body part. So if I zoom in on this, you can see that the hip and the knees are like kind of controlled by this part of the brain, whereas this whole side of the brain here is just to control the muscles in your face, like your neck, the eyebrows, the eyes, lips, and so on. And so you can kind of see that there's a correlation between like how much dexterity and control we have over those muscles are actually correlated to how much of the brain is dedicated to that. You can see most of our brain is dedicated to moving your face and your hands, and that's why you have like the most control over like those fine movements in your hand and face versus like, if you're trying to move your toes or your elbows or forearm, you have very little control over that. Same thing with the sensory cortex. These are where all your senses are processed. And again, you can see the most sensitive parts of the body also get the biggest chunks of the brain to process that. So again, your face, your lips, your tongue, and your hands, whereas the rest of your body is not going to be as sensitive. Okay, so what's kind of funny is someone's actually modeled this, and they made like a 3D model of what you would look like if your body was proportional to your motor and sensory cortex. And this is what it looks like. This is your sensory cortex, so you can see your hands and your lips have the greatest ability to sense stuff, and then again the face and the hands have a ton of neurons dedicated to motor movement. Okay? So that's kind of just a fun model to show you like what you are in terms of your brain distribution. The last thing I want to finish up with, and I will put the link here to show you guys this, but super cool, is a hold on, let me switch back to the webcam while I find the right website. Here we go, here it is. Okay, so this, let me switch back to the PowerPoint. This is a website, sketchfab.com. I don't exactly know what I guess it looks like they make 3D models that are a lot of anatomy stuff, but there's also some tech things involved here. But what's really cool, I can full screen this, is they have a model of the brain that is 3D that you can, check this out, you can move it all around. And a lot of students, like my sister went through PT school, you may know some people in med school, a lot of schools are using these 3D models as an alternative to dissection, just because one, it's a lot cleaner, right? And you don't have to like use a body for that, but it's also a great way to study. Now this one actually has like all these different parts labeled, so you can click on a part and it'll label it for you and maybe link, this in this case, the frontal lobe's link to the Wikipedia page where you can read up on it. And so you can kind of explore all the different parts of the brain and see what they do. Just want to highlight some of the things we've talked about, if it will let me zoom out a little more. So here on the outside, you see the cerebral cortex, and you see all those folding, all that folding. These are the folds, the bumps are called gyruses, and the valleys are called sulci, or sulcus, okay, which means valley. And again, that folding allows the human brain to pack in a lot more stuff into and have higher surface area, which means we're going to have higher increased brain capacity. Down at the bottom here, there's that cerebellum I was talking about that coordinates your muscle movement, and here you have your brainstem. If we turn it around and look at the inside, here's some features. There's that corpus callosum. That's the that white band you see connecting the left to the right brain. If I flip down here, you can see a couple of things. I might have to zoom in here. This is whoa. This is super cool. But right here, I don't know if you guys can see it, but right here, number 20, you can see it looks kind of like some testicles hanging down. That is your pituitary gland, and this right here is your hypothalamus. So these two right here, that's your homeostasis center for your body. Okay. Let's see, the things sticking out right here, I believe these are the olfactory nerves. Yeah, olfactory tract. These are the nerves that actually run to your nose for your sense of smell. Over here you have your amygdala. This is it's tiny, but this is actually where all your emotions come from. Isn't that crazy? Like your anger, your happiness, your joy, your everything is regulated in your amygdala. This also plays a role in facial recognition. So when you learn to recognize someone's faces and read their facial expressions, that's all done by this tiny little thing called your amygdala. And then attached to the amygdala, you see this big blue kind of arch, this curve that goes around. This is called your hippocampus. And the hippocampus, that's the ventricle. The hippocampus, I don't know where they labeled it, but the hippocampus is the structure where a lot of your memories are processed. And so your short-term, long-term memory processing is all in your hippocampus. And what's interesting is that when we zoom in here, you can see the hippocampus is very closely associated with both the amygdala, and it's relatively close to your olfactory tract. And what that means is that your memories are really heightened. And you guys may notice that a lot of your strongest memories, one, have a very emotional aspect to them, right? You had a great sense of joy or a great sense of anger or sadness, and that's because the hippocampus is directly working with the amygdala to manage those emotions and also store memories of those emotions. And not only that, the sense of smell, and I know this one only shows one of the olfactory tracts, but you can see on the other side of the brain, the olfactory tract from your nose actually runs up past the amygdala and into your hippocampus before it gets processed. And what that means is that our sense of smell is also really closely tied to memory. And that's why, certain smells can trigger a memory. It might be a certain perfume or a smell of a dish that your mom or your grandma used to cook a lot. We can smell things, and then it's like in Ratatouille. I don't know if you guys remember that scene where he eats the dish and then he zooms back to when he was a kid. That's an actual phenomenon that happens because of the close association with these parts of the brain. So really cool neuroscience of memory and stuff there. But if you're into researching memory and what happens when we lose memory, like when we have people have Alzheimer's, the hippocampus and the parts of the cerebral cortex that are storing memories are going to be an area that you're really going to want to look at. Here in the middle, this big pink thing. It's a little finicky here. This part right here, this is parts of your basal ganglia and your striatum and your putamen, and they make up a lot of the forebrain for your brain. Down below, you can see a bunch of other structures. You see all those blood vessels there. Those are coming directly out. This is coming directly off the aorta. These two little prongs right here connect to your jugular arteries, which if you remember, it comes straight down and hook up to the aortic arch. So when your heart is squeezing blood, a lot of that blood goes straight to the brain and provides the brain with oxygen and nutrients so that it can keep up with all those demands. So it's a really, really cool model. You can click around on this and check it out for yourself. And actually the website itself has a lot of other anatomy items. It looks like they have 179 different models, not just all from humans. They have other animals, I guess. But that'll keep you busy if you wanted to like click through and study how these things work. Some of these are really crazy. So I'll put that link below to this site, but that basically is all I have for you today. And I know a lot of you guys are not wanting to spend an hour on this, so I'm going to end this soon. Tomorrow we do have another live stream in the morning at 9:30. I think I like Zoom, so we'll get on Zoom and come ready with any questions you might have about the brain, and it could be related to the lecture or just stuff you're curious about. And yeah, that's it for me. So hope you have a great day. Hope that helps. If you have any questions, you can put them in the comment section below. That'll help me to come up with some answers for you for the live cast tomorrow. Okay, so that's it. Have a great one. Bye.